Welcome back, everybody. My name's Don Palmer. I want to thank you for attending this final session. Our final panel of the day will focus on change in the polling place and those unique challenges faced by different localities across the country and what the local election officials are doing to successfully manage that process to meet the needs of voters, to make the voter experience a positive one, and to increase voter confidence. Now, we know from the EAC's election administration survey, voting survey, and other sources that the policy and administrative challenges we have are constantly changing, and they're changing in different ways in different parts of the country at different times. Yet we all come to meet on Election Day in November, and we'll do that in 2020 as well. Whether we're implementing a new law on early voting or ballot translation, deploying poll books, electronic poll books, or new voting systems, or simply a policy change, it's the responsibility of a local election official to implement those changes, to train the poll workers at the polling place, to facilitate voters in implementing those laws, and lastly, to inform the voters of how those changes may impact the voting experience. So local election officials must also adjust to changes in how voters themselves are choosing to participate in the process. And voters have many options. So election administrators are in the business of preparing for that method of voting. It may be vote by mail, it may be early voting in person or some other means, or election day. So as early in-person voting spreads across the country, for example, many voters are taking advantage of that option. Traditional in-person election day voters accounted for 56% of all voters in the 2018 midterm elections. That seems significant, but it's actually lower from 80% in 2004. Including in this shift, you saw a shift away from election day voting. There was a big jump in in-person early voting from 2014 to the 2018 midterms. So election administrators need to recruit and train our fellow citizens as poll workers, and they will interact and serve the voters to arrive to cast a ballot. So to discuss this changing landscape of election administration in 2020 and how some of our top election officials are managing this change, we've assembled an esteemed panel of local election officials from across the country. To my immediate left, and I'll go right down the aisle here, is Dean Logan, who is the Registrar-Recorder, County Clerk for Los Angeles County, California, the nation's largest election jurisdictions in terms of registered voters. He is responsible for serving over 4 million voters and a plethora of new laws and procedures, voting equipment, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure he'll tell you about it, all starting in the March primary, just around the corner. Doris Clerk is the recorder for Navajo County, Arizona, a large geographic locality and home for multiple Indian reservations. She has served in this role since being elected in 2016. Ron Turner was elected as Supervisor of Elections for Sarasota County, Florida, White Sands, in 2016. However, he has served in Florida elections for over a decade. In fact, he was a supervisor of another county in Florida. So he has the full on-the-ground perspective of the diverse nature of elections in the Sunshine State. Currently, he serves as the treasurer of the Florida State Association of Supervisor of Elections. Kevin Yarbrough was elected clerk for Cook County, Illinois in 2018. Prior to serving as clerk, she served as the Cook County Recorder of Deeds and in the Illinois State Legislature as Assistant Majority Leader in the House. Also, this is always helpful, this background with legislatures, particularly when election officials are requesting necessary election funds. So continuing on, Gary Scott is the General Registrar and Director of Elections in Fairfax County, the largest county in the Commonwealth. And prior to assuming this role in 2018, Gary served as Deputy General Registrar of the county for more than 2 decades. And I had a chance to bond with Gary over the years, particularly with late nights of tabulating results and election recounts. So our panelists are now going to share some initial thoughts and then take some questions from me and the audience. And I'll start with Dean. Why don't you go ahead and start and talk about what's going on in Los Angeles County?
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Palmer, and thank you to the EAC for hosting the summit. It's great to be here today, and it's been a great program. I think it's appropriate that it comes full circle to this particular panel because so much of what we talked about today ultimately depends on how things operate at the voting locations on election day or in our case during the voting period. So we were asked to talk about how we're approaching election day challenges and election worker challenges. In Los Angeles County, we are embarking on a whole new era of a new voting experience. So the voting experience in Los Angeles County up to this time has been the same from a voter perspective as it was in 1968 when they first introduced punch card voting. And a lot, of course, has changed since 1968 in terms of the way we function and the way we interact with public processes. And we have spent nearly a decade in LA County gathering data and designing around that type of behavior and preference of our voters to introduce a new voting experience. So the first thing I would say is that the approach we're taking to dealing with election day challenges in a jurisdiction with 5.4 million registered voters that really represents every aspect of diversity that you can think of is to move away from that single day, single location voting model. So starting with the March election in Los Angeles County, voters will have the option to vote over the course of 11 days. We will begin opening vote centers, community vote centers, at 10 days before the election, 4 days before the election, so that final weekend leading up to Tuesday will increase the number of those locations, and voters in LA County can choose to go to any vote center in the county. So they're no longer assigned to a specific polling location. They can go to any vote center in the county and get their local ballot. They'll also be using a new voting system that allows for them to customize that voting experience to a large degree in terms of language selection, accessibility features, and even the option to use an interactive sample ballot that will allow them to prepare in advance and expedite their voting experience. So it's a whole new ballgame in Los Angeles County. We've been working very hard on this for a long time. In the midst of that project, they moved our primary from June to March, and so we are accelerating that effort. But it really is based on, and what you heard from the first panel today in Secretary Benson's comment, is this philosophy of meeting people where they are, of moving away from a system where the voters need to seek out the voting experience and actually approaching it from the standpoint of being visible in the community over the course of that 11 days so that when voters have that intrinsic movement, desire to have their voice heard, whether that's motivated by listening to a debate, talking to a friend, or whatever that may be, that somewhere in the course of their day-to-day lives during that voting period, they're going to see that there's a place that they can go in and cast their ballot and have their voice heard. So augment that to then what does that mean with election workers? That obviously changes the staffing model too. So we will be using more traditional county temporary employees and actual county employees from all of the county departments to serve as the lead workers at these vote centers to oversee those activities, and that'll be augmented by community election workers and student workers. I think what's, from an administration standpoint, what is exciting about this is it really addresses a lot of the challenges that we've faced on election day in the past. One, it gives us that full 10-day period to begin to predict and see what's happening out there and gives us an opportunity to react to that other than on a single day. It also allows us to move workers who can work in the early vote centers to actually be trained on the job, and then they become the lead workers at the vote centers later in the day. And ultimately, it reduces provisional ballots and confusion for voters, especially in a presidential primary where in California, your party preference is going to dictate which ballot you get. So just to kind of wrap that up as a way to illustrate that the two most significant reasons that we issued provisional ballots in LA County in major elections are that voters went to the wrong polling place, or they're listed as having been sent a vote-by-mail ballot and they didn't have it with them to surrender in order to vote a regular ballot. Both of those things go away in this model. There is no wrong location. Every location is the right election. And if you don't have that vote-by-mail ballot with you, we can clear that and issue a regular ballot on site. So it really does give both us as administrators the ability to resolve some of those issues, but it also empowers voters to resolve any issues that they may have that would be considered barriers to their voting experience.
Outstanding. Doris?
Okay, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm glad to be here. I've never been this far from home, this way east. Really interesting. I enjoyed my visit and seeing all the sites yesterday. We in Navajo County, Navajo County is one of the 15 counties in Arizona. And we have about 76,000 registered voters, that's active and inactive put together. And I came on as an election worker in 1990, and we have come a long ways since then. When I first came on, we were under a federal consent decree. The county had been sued, and instead of the lawsuit, they decided we will do these things. And a lot of it was election requirements, terminology requirements. And so, being so spread out, we have, in Arizona, there's over 20 recognized Native American tribes, and I think all the counties we have similar situations with recruiting and training poll workers, interpreters. And so we had this consent decree, and we needed to go by it, and we needed to get out and do the voter education. And in Navajo County, we have the Hopi Reservation, the White Mountain Apache Reservation, and we also have the Navajo Reservation. And to this day, as hard as it may be to believe, there are still people out there that do not have electricity and running water. And so we thought, and so we can't advertise TV, maybe not newspaper, but in Indian country, every home has a radio. If they don't have electricity, they have a battery-operated radio in every home. And so we start getting our voter education out there, and we're using different terminology. We're saying the same thing, but we're saying it differently. And so we decided, okay, we need to get together because these voters are not going to learn anything if it's said this way in this county and this way in this county. And so the Navajo, and then along with a few of the other tribes, they sent representatives, and while we're working on our Navajo glossary, they starting to figure out how they could come up with their own election terms. So we compiled this booklet from the first day that we met until the finished product. I would say it was probably about 2 years. We have the booklet, and I didn't think to bring it, but it was basically, if I could take you to, a lot of you may have seen that movie, Nicolas Cage and the Wind Talkers, about the World War II veterans, how they had to use the Navajo language. So, like tank, in the Navajo culture, we wouldn't just say, hey, there's a word for tank, or artillery. So we had to come up, and it's the same with election terms. We don't have early ballot, or, that's just not part of our language. So we had to sit and think, okay, how are we going to come up with this term? And it took a lot of work, but what it ended up being is an effective method, a tool to use to educate the voters throughout all the different counties. We used one radio station, and so whatever we were talking about, they were all understanding it, and we're still using it to this day. And new requirements come up, new equipment come up. So to this day, they still meet and update the terms and the glossary that go into that book. And I have a passion for translation, interpreting, letting people know that maybe they couldn't understand. My mom was uneducated. She didn't go to school, so she doesn't read and write. And we have a Spanish, Hispanic employee in our office, Jose. I get all excited when somebody comes to the counter and can't speak English, and I run and get him, and it just thrills me to know that he can help these people that can't speak and help them understand. And so I really have had that passion over the years to be able to make sure that all the voters get the information that they need. I guess that's about it.
That's great. That's great.
Hey, that was good. Put things in perspective, didn't it?
So Ron?
Well, thanks to the EAC for having us here. Thanks to Commissioner Palmer. Commissioner Palmer was the state elections director in the Sunshine State in the great state of Florida. So thanks for your service there. And so it's great to be with you and hear about how other jurisdictions are handling Election Day challenges coming up. Florida has its presidential preference primary on March 17th. I believe when I was talking to my Chicago colleague, Cook County colleague here, same day, St. Patrick's Day. So we'll all be wearing our shamrocks or green I voted stickers maybe. But one of the things that was shared in the panels, one of the panels this morning, and I think it was Tammy Patrick's slide, in Florida, you would notice that we have 3 ways to vote. And we have vote by mail, early voting, which takes place a minimum of 8 days, 8 hours a day prior to an election. Vote by mail, which is no excuse. Vote by mail, anyone can request a vote by mail ballot through 2 general election cycles. And then we have the traditional election day model. If you notice from that slide, we have about a third, and a third of our voters choosing those different methods in Florida. So we end up administering essentially 3 different election models in Florida. Our UOCAVA ballots go to military and overseas voters for this March election beginning January 31st. Then our domestic vote by mail ballots are now being mailed in Florida 40 days prior to an election. That's the earliest date that we can mail them under a new Florida statute that took effect in this last legislative cycle. So the challenges there, we have to have the staff not only for Election Day, but for that early voting period and to augment our permanent staff and our office that we have in the weeks and the months leading up to an election. I will say for poll workers in particular, we have a number of poll workers that, and I'm sure that this is the case with other elections jurisdictions, that stay with us through numerous election cycles because they like what they do. I don't think it's that they're necessarily enjoying the 15 or 16-hour days and the large pay that we give them. But I do think that they feel a sense of civic pride and a sense of civic duty, as we all do, in carrying out our jobs as elections administrators in the United States. But to help recruit poll workers that we need for Election Day, one of the things that we have been doing in our county is doing this recruitment all year round, every year, not just during or prior to an election cycle. That this is something that is a continual process of recruitment, using hopefully poll workers who have had a good experience as word-of-mouth type customers, but also traditional media, social media, community groups. Another panel today talked about kind of collaboration and collaborative governance, and that certainly takes place to a great degree in what we're doing. Certainly a challenge with poll workers, however, are these are people that are working a few days every couple of years. I know in our case in Florida, we have a minimal amount of training under Florida statutes that's required. However, in our county, we give them much more than that, either in person and augment some of the routine type matters for training to an online platform for them and try to spend more time with them in hands-on exercises or real world type exercises and challenges and things that they might have faced with voters or with equipment, and try to focus on the areas that are the highest priority for them. When you're opening a polls, what type of challenges you're going to face during the day, or what types of things that you need to know when you're closing the polls, when the polls are closed in the evening, and what events and processes are a particular priority for us, for our office, for the voters of our county in particular. With that, I'll wrap up.
Okay, you didn't even have to give you a minute. I
Thank you,
too,
Karen. Go ahead.
I too
Thank you,
am grateful for this opportunity to talk about some of the challenges that we anticipate and challenges we've had in the past. I only have a year under my belt as an election authority. You read my bio, so you know where I've been. 2020 is going to be a big year for us, though. Not only do I have to get through this election cycle, but by the end of the year, we will be absorbing the Recorder of Deeds office, and we have to have that done by December. So while March 17th starts something, the end of the year will be something else. We oversee elections, taxes, vitals, and then everything else that comes in between. So life happens, and it usually happens in the clerk's office. We're responsible for that. When I looked at and listening to my colleagues, it certainly put some things in perspective for me. While we're a big municipality, our county is large, but not as large as LA County. We have about 1.5 million voters. But we have new election equipment for this year, and we piloted it last year. And I tell you, the experience for our three areas was a good experience, so good that one of the people who voted in that election said, you know, I love the machines. I just love them. I want to marry the machine. And I said, well, I think we're going a little too far there. But needless to say, they had good experience in these townships that we piloted the program. And we're looking forward to rolling it out. So what's happening in my office right now is the disassembling of the old equipment and bringing in the new equipment. Over the course of, let me just say that we embrace trying to get everybody who wants to vote. So we have same-day voting. And another first for Cook County is we're actually going to be going into the prison and have polling places in the prison. We're doing that because those people haven't been adjudicated. They're there waiting for their day in court. And while we do have, they could vote if they wanted to by early voting, but we decided to take it a step further. And so that'll be something new for us. I'm looking forward to it. I plan to be there on that day. I want to see how it rolls out. Not that I'm interested in being in jail, but that's where we're going to help people to vote that day. And I think I'm going to close for now. I'm sure we'll get into some other things later.
Thank you, Gary.
You know, in the great scheme of things, Fairfax County is not that huge a locality, but one voter out of 7 in the Commonwealth of Virginia is in Fairfax County, which creates some, to our perspective, unique situations, but we've been blessed with a local governing authority which has always supported us and always ponied up the resources that we've needed. But even with those resources, like everyone else, we have a problem recruiting and retaining election officers. I went to a conference one year where it was a local government's conference, and one of my fellow registrars, I was an assistant at that time, said, we were talking about recruiting election officers, and they said the average age of their election officers was deceased. And I was thinking, how lucky you are. Ours have generally been dead for about 3 years. But it's keeping that pool going and reaching out to that. And we go out into the high schools to try to recruit election officers. We go into the local university and try to recruit election officers. But trying to bring younger people into that election officer pool is a big challenge. Fairfax County is unique in Virginia as well as being the only locality that is mandated to provide voting materials in languages other than English. So that created a unique problem because we had to create all of those materials. I'm fortunate that on our staff we have native speakers in all the mandated languages. So we were able to create that and proof everything in-house, including the election officer recruiting materials. And we've traditionally reached out through the local communities, the Spanish language community, the Vietnamese language community, and the Korean language community to recruit fluent speakers to put in our polling places to assist the voters. But in the last year, we've also been reaching out to our non-mandated language groups. We have a large Indian community, so we've been looking for speakers of Hindi and Urdu. We have a large Kurdish community, so I happen to have a Kurdish native speaker on my staff, so we've been reaching out into them. But it's a difficult sell for us to go into those communities because their cultural background is different than ours. And many of them, being from the government is an item of suspicion rather than I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. We're all familiar with that program. But trying to reach out and using those associations, the language associations, the ethnic associations to help us recruit election officers. And that has been a huge challenge. Virginia has, unlike most states, has a general election every single year. State elections in odd-numbered years, federal elections in even-numbered years. So this gives us a unique challenge. Unlike most states who have 2 years to prepare for every general election, we've got 1 year. This year I've got face 3 countywide elections, two countywide primaries and the general election, plus town elections in May, and then preparing for redistricting next year. So it's coming up with the resources, coming up with the staffing, coming up with the personnel to do all of these things that has created a unique challenge for us. And I say a unique challenge, it's probably not unique. Every locality in here has the same issues that we do as far as recruiting and retaining staff. To the extent that we've even had members of our legislature come to us asking about legislation that would allow us to choose election officers the same way they choose jury pools, which we opposed. We don't want any non-volunteers working in our election office. But, you know, we get by. Again, we're blessed with a local governing authority that gives us all the resources we need to conduct our elections, and we'll even go a bit further. That's pretty much where we stand.
Well, thank you, Gary. So this first question is for all. So each of you, I believe each of you discussed a policy change or a unique challenge, a change in law in your locality that will impact the voting process for jurisdictions. I think we heard about early voting, new systems, same-day registration, a law change in Florida. What strategies are you adopting in your jurisdiction to sort of have your poll workers make sure that they're equipped to handle these changes to maintain a positive voting experience for your voters? Any one of you can start.
Well, our situation, this is the first year that Virginia is going to offer absentee voting without requiring an excuse. And under the current law, it's for a very limited period of time, only for a roughly 8-day period prior to the election, and it would only apply to in-person voters. The General Assembly is currently in session, and there are many bills which would extend that out for the entire absentee voting period and let it apply to vote by mail as well. Now, I've heard like Florida has a 40-day period. We start voting absentee in person 46 days out from the election. And this would extend that out further, but the change we look at is going to be a matter of scale. As it stands now, just under a quarter of our voters vote absentee for a large general election. And this year I'm looking at perhaps that going up to a third. We have 11 locations around the county where people can vote in person absentee. We're adding 2 additional ones this year, and I hope to add 2 additional ones the year after, because I see as we go to no excuse absentee voting, the shift, like everyone else is seeing, is going to be moving from election day voting to pre-election day voting. And that the only thing that we can look forward to in the absentee process is growth. We have to be careful about managing that. 2008, we really pushed absentee voting, vote early, you won't have to stand in line on election day and all of this. So people were standing in line waiting to vote early, and there were no lines on election day. And then 4 years later, everybody goes, aha, I remember I had to stand in line to vote absentee, so I'm going back to election day. And we had no absentee voters, and everybody was showing up for election day. But I think with the General Assembly moving this to no excuse for the entire period, that's going to permanently change the environment in which we vote.
I'll go next. Having new voting equipment, we're having to train all of our folks. So we've got about 8,000 people that we've reached out to already for election day, but for any of it, we have to train all of these folks. We've rolled out what we call a PPT, which is a polling place technician. So that person is responsible for anything that may go wrong with the voting equipment. In prior years, we had 1 per precinct. This year, we're going to have 1 per polling place. So training is what we're in the midst of doing now. As my colleague here mentioned about older folks who have done these jobs over the years, they're not dead. Ours aren't dead, but they feel like this is now the time for some young people to step up. So we are in the schools and in the colleges and talking to people all the time. This is a year-round process for us to talk about being a part of the solution. Elections have consequences and all of those kinds of things to get their attention, to come in, get trained. And although we can't pay them what they're really, really worth, because I think the outside dollar amount is about $325 for the day. And that's not a lot, but they're, in prior years, maybe they got less. But we don't put an emphasis on the dollar amount. We put the emphasis on be a part of this. This is your government. You should be involved. You should be engaged. And I've even begged some of the older workers, when they see the new equipment and they see how easy it is, maybe they'll come back.
So we've heard from Fairfax and Cook County, and they mentioned the age of their poll workers. Their poll workers actually retired to Sarasota County.
That's true.
And we love them, everyone. Keep coming. One of the challenges for us in this presidential preference primary that's coming up, that I know my colleague David Stafford in Escambia County, who spoke earlier, and there are 32 counties in Florida that have a federal court order to provide language assistance under a Section 4E provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act, not the 203 provision. So we've all been learning about that in Florida quite rapidly. We have to have these language assistance, Spanish and English provisions in place for the presidential preference primary. So we've all been kind of racing against the clock to get the baseline that we need for this language assistance. So when we have this established, I know as a colleague from Fairfax talked about, then hopefully this will be a little easier from a management perspective for future elections. But from a poll worker standpoint in the polling location, and then being on the front lines dealing with voters who are seeing these changes, is just trying to embrace this in a positive way, that we're helping voters, we're helping those with limited language ability, those who have language assistance needs, and that this is a positive change for us. And that, again, we are in the customer service business. That's how we have to look at this and embrace this, not from a purely bureaucratic function of serving voters and the public, but that these are our customers, that we are providing a service, and we want to provide the best service that we can, and we want repeat customers that want to come back and vote in our county.
So, Gary, offline, you mentioned to a number of us that Fairfax County was preparing for 90% turnout in November, and as well as implementing the no excuse early voting. For everybody, for who wants to address the issue, including Gary, what factors are driving that, your turnout projections, and what are your strategies to deal with it so we can mitigate long lines or potential long lines and sort of facilitate the turnout?
Well, we're, again, once the General Assembly finishes their session, and hopefully they will have changed the no excuse absentee voting requirements, then we're going to be making a dedicated effort to encourage people to utilize the no excuse and not, avoid election day. In 2016, we had almost 85% turnout in Fairfax County, and so we're basing our projection on the fact that it's politically a very active community, and that this is going to be a very contentious election, and that's going to drive people to the polls. And that's why we are projecting. I mean, I'm planning on ordering enough ballots to cover 110% of our registered voters, just to cover that with provisional ballots and everything else. But again, it's a matter of scale. It's not going to be that much of a jump from 84% or 85% to 90%. And if we can drive those individuals to our, at this time, 13 satellite locations for absentee voting, that will greatly cut our problems down on election day.
Anybody else in the panel like to address the issue?
I'll just mention that I think that as we heard on the panel this morning, I think that I think there's no doubt that we're going to have unprecedented turnout in November. I think in California we're looking at a fairly unusual circumstance in our March 3rd primary, in that California is still in play in the presidential nomination process, and we're expecting really high turnout in that election too. I think that for us, the themes we're dealing with across all of these issues are change management and capacity, and we're really focused right now on the fact that we've developed a model with and for the voters of Los Angeles County, but we're also all creatures of habit. So having an 11-day voting period is great if voters distribute themselves across those 11 days of voting. And there's not a lot of data out there. And actually what data is out there in jurisdictions that have done this still shows a front load on Tuesday on election day. So we're really committing resources to a public outreach and education campaign, mass media campaign, even looking at creative options of within that 11-day voting period, while anybody can vote on any of those days, maybe we'll have some theme days where we have one day where we really focus on building a sense of community around people who are voting for the first time, or particular demographics in the community as a way to do that, and also advertising pretty broadly each day where we're at with turnout. Sort of this concept that the longer you wait to vote, the longer you may wait to vote if you wait till election day. So I think a lot of it is that commitment of time and resources, that recognizing what we know based on what we heard this morning, that the turnout is going to be high, that we have to prepare for the fact that when you're implementing a new model, that initial upfront investment includes investing in the change management and the outreach and education that goes along with it.
So Ron, do you see any changes in Florida? Just looking back at 16, I really do think it was a third on the method of voting, and it was just utilized so much by both parties and very active competitive race. Do you see any changes in 20, or do you think it'll pretty much be very, very active using all the forms of voting, vote by mail, early voting, and election day?
I think it'll be very active. In 2016, during the presidential general election, then early voting. So in-person early voting was the most popular way to vote, I know, in our county. Then vote by mail, then election day. We're seeing fewer people vote on election day. We will be kind of undertaking to some degree, what Dean was just talking about, which is encouraging voters to be fully aware of the different methodologies that they have to vote, and possibly to vote before Election Day, so we don't have everyone showing up to the polls on Election Day. But I suspect that we will continue to have the 3 ways to vote. But I will say this, that I think that just looking at past historic norms can help inform our decision making, but I don't think we should base our decision making in this business on those anymore. And we saw that in Florida to some degree, taking the 2018 midterm election and comparing it to 2014, there wasn't any comparison.
No.
So to use those past kind of trends and numbers, again, they can help someone inform your decision making, but you can't completely rely on that. So to answer your question, we're going to look for historic highs in every method of voting and use every resource that we have available to communicate with our voters and provide the best service that we can to them.
Yeah. We've set up selfie stations at the polling places, and the people love it. They just absolutely love it. And so we're going to roll all those out, for this year as well in the primary and in the general election. Something about seeing their picture does something for them. So the other thing for us, we're rolling out 2 new languages, Korean and Tagalog. And I remember when I was in the legislature, we had a Korean group to come and ask us, when can we finally see our language, and I mean, I'm a state legislator, and I'm like, oh, you want that? So when I was Recorder of Deeds, they came to my office and they said, we're following you. I said, okay, check with me on the next place. And so we're really excited about them, and they're really excited about being able to vote. So we know in that particular, they're concentrated in a particular area, so we're going to be looking at those numbers there too.
Well, thanks for bringing up that issue, the issue of language assistance. What strategies, each of you have sort of touched on it, but there are specific strategies for recruiting not just poll workers, but bilingual poll workers and all the plethora of languages that many of you have in your jurisdiction. Could you just talk a little bit about those strategies and what has worked for you in recruiting poll workers and bilingual poll workers?
Well, if I could
Go
just
ahead.
continue with the Koreans, as I said, they had already come to me. They were looking for this, they care and they wanted me to care. And so when the opportunity came, I just, jumped right into it. But since they're there, we're also recruiting them to be our language experts. And we've done that with all of our languages. We usually hire folks on staff, or we have them on staff already, because we want people to feel comfortable wherever they are with whatever language that they have. I think in the general election, we're going to roll out 7 more languages, so that it'll be exciting. 2020 is our year.
Go ahead.
I would just say similar. I mean, so in LA we have 13 languages, and now that you can, traditionally the bilingual poll workers were targeted based on geographical location and census data. And now with a model where you can go anywhere to vote, that means we need to have language assistance in all languages at all locations. And part of that was built into the design of the voting equipment and the voting experience. But I think it all comes down to what we heard earlier today is those partnerships, that talking to the people in the community and having them help us recruit, but also review our materials. I think for too long, language access and accessibility access has just been a checkbox of compliance in elections administration, and I think that that we're seeing a shift towards a focus of not just meeting the minimum requirements of the law, but how do we do that in a meaningful way so that when somebody needs language assistance, they don't feel intimidated about it, they don't feel embarrassed to ask for that assistance, and that we provide that in a way that helps them to access the system immediately. And you can't do that without partnerships. You have to go spend time in the community with the organizations, get feedback from them about their voting experience in the past and what their expectations are.
And in Navajo County, we've got also a change. We're moving our primary up like about 3 weeks. It used to be the end of August, and now it's going to be the beginning of August. And the Navajo tribe will coincide their election date with our election date. So we are always having to compete with poll workers, and they go with the tribal elections because they paid more than we would. So this year, the county is talking right now about raising the interpreters' pay, so it is going to be competitive. And we're also expecting a large number of voters coming out, always in the 2016 election, only because they coincide. It's a big day because it's a tribal election day and also a county federal. And like Recorder Hansen in Coconino, she mentioned this morning that it's a social event, you know, even though you promote ballot by mail, and it's going up, but we will never get a high percentage of it because a lot of them like to go to the polling place. And we always, as much as we do need the moisture down in our area, on election day, we always pray for dry rain because there are still a lot of dirt roads out there, and people have to commute to their polling place. But that's what they're doing. And the Raylene Richards, and our elections director in our county, she's anticipating this voter higher turnout also, and she's going to order more of the express vote machines to help with that. But it is hard to recruit, and we're reaching more now into different organizations, tribal departments, and seeing if we can get these qualified people on board.
Well, it is very important. Really, serving as a poll worker is like serving your neighbor, and your registration is important, voting is important, but if you have the extra time to assist your fellow citizens by actually being a poll worker, training and being a poll worker, you're doing a lot for your country and for your neighbors. That's a great issue to talk about. I wish we had more time. There is one more question from me to everyone on this panel, and then great to open it up to the audience. So the last question is, throughout the day, several of the speakers have spoken about misinformation, influence campaigns. How do we deal with that? And the importance of election officials serving as trusted information sources. So in each of your jurisdictions, maybe you can highlight what is that one urban myth that you would like to bust. And now's your opportunity to talk about what is that little bit of misinformation that you wish voters across the country would know is not true, and that you should look to your election official for the correct information. I'll start with Dean. We'll just go down the line.
I think that after doing this for 30 years, I think the one that still surprises me is every election when people ask if vote-by-mail ballots and provisional ballots are only counted if there's a close contest. And if we could eliminate that would be great. But I think even beyond that is just this sense of, and unfortunately it's perpetuated by some of the campaigns, that there's any tossing of ballots. That just because a ballot's not counted on election night doesn't mean that it's not counted and that it's not included in the final certified results. And that even if the margin of victory is 90% to 10%, we still count every valid vote before we certify the election.
And that would be the same with Navajo County. I think we've been also told, we heard that they don't really count. And one voter came in and she told me that, and reluctantly kind of just threw us her ballot. And I said, no, if you have time, come with me up to the warehouse. We're doing the early board right now. I want you to see what they're doing. So she had 2 other people with her, and we went up to the warehouse, and we showed them the process, the board, how it gets verified and how it gets tabulated. So I think that would probably be one of ours too, is that it does count.
We have the same. I mean, I started in elections in 1994, so I don't think that one's any different, as Dean said. I always tell voters that if you vote by mail in Florida, you're the first ones that get to vote. You get your ballot first, you get to return it first, your votes are tabulated first, and then on election night, the first results that are released after the polls closed are the vote by mail and early vote. So you get the best of everything as far as that's concerned. But I will say, just generally, I think with a more active news cycle and social media and just platforms for sharing information, which are wonderful and helpful to us, I would just caution people to check with their secretaries of states or local elections administrators to be that trusted source of information in elections. If they have any questions, that's what we're here for. Again, we talked about that customer service model and that we want to help the voters and answer their questions if they're not sure about something. So maybe not take something that they're seeing on social media platform at face value all the time.
I think I'm going to come from a different perspective. This is something that's just simply not true. But for the voter that says, my vote doesn't count. And how many election cycles have we seen where that one vote made the difference? I just wish that the voters would understand that each and every vote does in fact count. And you could be the linchpin. You could be the person who kicked it over the edge and made somebody very, very happy.
Well, it leaves me for last. Everybody's covered all the good stuff. I would echo what everyone else says. Getting people to understand that election officers or election officials have been doing this for many years. They're there to facilitate people getting registered, getting them the ability to vote, and setting it up so they can vote in the most convenient, most expeditious manner possible. And that regardless of what if you see on social media, question it, and if you have any doubts, ask your local election officials. They're there to serve you. I mean, that's the biggest part. On election day, we will have 2 or 3 people set up in our public information office who do nothing but counterfactuals against social media all day. And most of which would have been unnecessary if people just said, really? That doesn't make any sense. Why would that be happening? But that would be our big issue. You know, just because somebody has a fancy letterhead doesn't mean they know what they're talking about.
Thank you all for that question. Now, we'd open it up to audience Q&A if we have time. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I'm an elections officer in Virginia, and as Mr. Scott knows, Virginia actually had that situation where one vote actually shifted the General Assembly majority in terms of which party was in control. My question has to do with a personal experience, not of me, but of a colleague who's a chief elections officer, who said that there is a Korean senior citizens living facility that brings busloads of their members to her polling place. They do not speak English by and large, but the person who accompanies them is bilingual and actually ends up, she believes, filling out their ballots for them. And as an elections officer, she wants to know how to deal with that, because she's not certain that the voters are voting for the candidates they choose or whether their assistant is voting for the candidate the assistant chooses. Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question, and I guess my initial reaction to that is that it's something that ought to be first looked at in terms of the legal framework, in terms of what's permissible in a particular state. That shouldn't be something that's discretionary to a particular jurisdiction or a particular polling location. I think you have to be careful with that there's a difference between allowing a qualified elector to self-select to have who they want assist them in the voting process, and then there's a fine line between that and coercion or disrupting the voting process. And for me, that's where the line would be in terms of what's happening in the actual voting center, which is what's under our jurisdiction, is what's appropriate in that sense. Having one person marking multiple ballots, I think would be concerning. That would definitely raise red flags. I think there are ways that procedurally you can make that less of an occurrence, and I think that's part of what we've been trying to achieve with the voting equipment and making the voting equipment accessible in all languages for all voters, so that we limit the need for a voter to have assistance in the voting process. On the other hand, getting them there and boosting participation, I think it'd be great if every community was doing that.
I just was thinking about that, and I think I would probably, offer our assistance from our office, and then even maybe volunteer to go to the center so they don't have to get bussed in, and see if, offer to provide the translation and hire translators from our office and offer that service.
Yeah, Florida has a supervised voting program where we actually go into certain types of centers or facilities to offer assistance with bipartisan teams of individuals that help kind of facilitate that. It's not necessarily a language asistancing, although it could be now in our new environment with providing language assistance in my county, but it is a statewide law and something we do. I know we do a lot of that leading up to the general election in Florida to assist voters in my county.
Something along the same line is in nursing homes where you have sometimes people who are frail and not maybe quite, not really knowing exactly what they want to do, or maybe they do, and you may have somebody there. So we usually have someone from our office there at the site to help anybody who needs help.
And we have had that situation arise, although it's mainly at our satellite in-person absentee voting. There are a couple of facilities that will send bus loads. We know what satellites they go to, so we make sure there is a Korean speaker at that satellite, and they actually insert themselves between the assistant and the people who are voting, because we did find that, we did inform this, in one case, this young lady, we asked to see, Virginia requires that each voter fill out a request for assistance form, where they do specify that they request assistance in voting, and she didn't have any of them, so we said, okay, you're out of the process. You step over here, we will provide all the language assistance, and we provide the ballot in Korean, so that the assistance really was in getting the request form filled out. But yeah, we've had that, and we address it by having, where we can, someone interject between the individual, one, to listen to what they're saying to the voters. In one case, we found the voters had no idea they were going to go absentee voting. They thought they were on a day outing from the retirement facility. And so once we got that cleared up and, again, got the assistant out of the way, everything went quite smoothly.
So while we look for the next question, it just stresses the importance of highly trained, in this case it'd be the chief of a polling place, with the other officers. They're all trained to deal with situations that might occur that out of the blue, you have a situation, and the more trained they are, the better they can handle the situation, as just talked about by the panel. Next question.
Hi, I'm Beth Tudon. I'm one of the deceased Fairfax County election officers. Now it explains a lot. We use iPads now to check in, which is going really well. I was just curious what other places are using for the check-in process. And Gary, you might want to speak about Fairfax County. But Thank you.
So that's part of the new model in Los Angeles County of enabling people to go to any location, is that we will use electronic poll books, tablet-based electronic poll books that have the full database of all voters. We're also implementing same-day or conditional voter registration, so you can actually register or change your registration on site at that time as well.
Just one more thing and then we'll wrap it up.
As Beth said, we use iPads, but we have scanners for them. Virginia requires photo IDs for voting, and most people use their driver's license or a DMV-issued identification, which our scanners will. We use the scanners that will scan the DMV barcode, and that speeds up the check-in process incredibly. So we don't see a delay in checking in. Now where we see the delay is people filling out their ballots and voting. And that's where the backup comes. We can process the people checking in several times faster than the people can actually vote and get out of the polling place.
Well, this concludes our final panel of the day. Please join me in thanking our panelists.